Hi there, it's Larold. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite tank classes in World of Warcraft, Blood Death Knight. Now, I will admit I've called quite a lot of classes my favorite over the years, or months, or even just the last couple of days, but with DK, I really mean it. So let's just dive right into what I consider the pros and cons of playing a Blood DK. Number 1, with a bullet, it's Death Grip. Death Grip is unique, powerful utility on a relatively short cooldown. Death Grip doesn't get a ton of use in raids, although Gorfiend's Grasp can be really strong for pulling packs of ads together on ad fights. In Mythic dungeons and world content, though, Death Grip is everything. Death Grip is as important to a DK as filling is to pie, or bread is to sandwiches. Without it, you just have crust, or mustard on your hands. No thanks. Next up, you have self-healing, and tons of it. Blood Death Knights often outperform healers. That's how aggressive they are with the amount of healing they put out. Blood also has incredible utility for Mythic Plus. In addition to the big names of Death Grip and Gorfiend's Grasp, they also have a combat res, a big single target stun, and AMS, which you can use to soak up irritating ground effects like the stun circles from the last boss of Court of Stars. I like to pop AMS and eat up like 4 or 5 of those things when the room starts to get crowded. Bone Shield is easy to maintain, and it's a great defensive and offensive buff. And finally, Blood deals tons of AoE DPS. Between Bone Storm, Consumption, Blood Boil, the Legendary Chest, Death and Decay, Heart Strike, Blood is just built to deal massive AoE damage. Now let's cover the cons. The first, overwhelmingly, is mobility. Blood mobility is terrible. It's pathetic. It's literally the worst mobility WoW has to offer. If Wraith Walk were a sandwich, it would be a slice of cold American cheese and a fistful of mayonnaise slammed between the bottom of a hamburger bun and a frozen blueberry waffle. It is truly awful, and I really hope it dies in battle for Azeroth. Single target DPS is another spot where Blood DK isn't that great. While they're not the worst, they're pretty near the bottom of the barrel when it comes to dealing single target damage. And lastly, the class is really vulnerable to Mortal Strike effects. This deserves primary mention due just to the Necrotic affix. Necrotic is brutal to all tanks, and Blood is able to play around with it a little bit using anti-magic shell, but ultimately it's pretty bad for Blood. Now let's dive into how the class's resources actually function. Death Knight has 2 resources, runes and runic power. With respect to runes, you have 6 runes that function in 2 pairs of 3, with an independent 10-second base cooldown on the first pair that causes the second pair to be queued up afterward. So just as an example, if I walk up to an enemy and I spent all 6 runes immediately with 1 hit, I would have 3 runes on cooldown for 10 seconds, and then 3 more runes on cooldown for 20 seconds. Because there is no way to regenerate your runes except through waiting, haste is incredibly valuable to Blood. Now as for runic power, each rune spent generates 10 runic power, and you spend runic power by casting Death Strike. Runic power is basically your resource for self-healing. Before moving on to talents and the ability priority, I just want to cover a couple of important things to know about some of the major skills for the class. One little nuance of Death Grip to be aware of is that it grips your enemy directly in front of you. Because Death Grip is off the global cooldown, it can be useful as a quick interrupt, but if you use it on an enemy that is already directly in front of you, it may not move them. So if you're tanking an enemy and you need to quickly interrupt them, turn to the side slightly, then cast Death Grip, and they'll move just a little bit. This will interrupt their cast without requiring you or the DPS to run all over the place. Dancing Rune Weapon is a major offensive and defensive cooldown that I haven't really mentioned thus far. With Mouth of Hell from the artifact tree, it actually summons 2 rune blades. This means that when you cast Marrow Rend while it's active, you instantly generate the maximum of 10 Bone Shield stacks. And there are a couple of other bonuses as well. Heartstrike generates 25 runic power rather than its usual 15. Blood Boil puts 3 separate Blood Plague debuffs on targets, and counts as 3 casts for the legendary shoulders instead of only 1. And your Death Strike healing is increased as well. As for Anti-Magic Shell, in addition to being useful for soaking mechanics, it's very effective at preventing bosses from applying or refreshing debuffs. This can prevent having to taunt swap, which can result in significantly higher raid DPS or just simply massively reducing your damage taken from a boss. Now let's move on to the talent setup. Blood Death Knights have a pretty solid all-purpose build that's useful for just about every situation. And here it is. I will go through tier by tier and just point out some of the talents that can be swapped around if needed. In the first tier, Blood Drinker is the primary option. In the second tier, Rapid Decomposition is worth taking about 99% of the time. Spectral Deflection can be useful for preventing massive burst damage from killing you, but at this point in the expansion with health values where they are, there's really almost no reason to ever take it. Similarly, Ossuary in the third tier is a lot better at speeding up the rotation and making the class a lot more efficient with their resources. You can take Anti-Magic Barrier to survive burst damage, but as with Spectral Deflection in the second tier, it's pretty much never worth taking anymore now that health values are as large as they are. In the fourth tier, Red Thirst is the talent of choice. It greatly reduces the cooldown of Vampiric Blood, which is your first line of defense, and the other 2 talents are pretty crappy. March of the Damned increases your Pathetic Wraith Walk and makes it into quite a bit better skill for mobility. It's still pretty bad, but if you need to travel a long distance while not actively engaging anything in combat, March of the Damned helps out quite a bit. For any situation where you might need to kite enemies or just simply want to Gorfiend's Grasp more often, so pretty much every mythic dungeon, Tightening Grasp winds up being a lot better option than March of the Damned. The sixth tier has 2 decent options. Foul Bulwark is worth taking 95% of the time. A 10 to 20% maximum health increase is definitely better than a very small defensive cooldown. However, in raids there are situations where you might want to take Rune Tap, just simply to counter a boss doing a large strike ability on a pretty predictable cooldown. Rune Tap is really solid for that kind of mechanic. In the final tier, you have 2 viable options, and then Purgatory. I'm really only mentioning Purgatory to say that it's not particularly great most of the time. However, each death on Argus causes it to reset, which makes it quite a lot stronger on that one particularly important fight than it is throughout the rest of the world. Bone Storm is primarily an AoE DPS talent. It does provide a lot of self-healing when used in large-scale AoE, but ultimately, it's really intended to be a massive damage-dealing ability more than anything else. Blood Mirror is sort of a mix of a defensive cooldown and an offensive cooldown. It allows you to just directly turn damage taken into damage output. It's not bad, it's definitely the most versatile of the 3 options in the tier. Alright, let's move on to the ability priority. Blood Death Knights have a pretty fluid and forgiving ability rotation. It's more like spinning a bunch of plates than playing whack-a-mole. You'll start pretty much every pull off by casting Blood Boil to apply Blood Plague to all your enemies, and then casting Marrow Rend at least once, usually twice right in a row, to get your Bone Shield stacks up. Once you can comfortably keep 5 stacks of Bone Shield active, fill with Heart Strike where you can, and try to keep Blood Boil, Death and Decay, Consumption, and Blood Drinker all on cooldown. The beginning of a pull is usually one of the most dangerous spots for Blood. Using Dancing Rune Weapon immediately once you're in melee range will let you get Bone Shield up to 10 stacks right off the bat, which should help you keep it up there pretty easily for the rest of the pull. Now on the subject of Death Strike, timing Death Strikes is not the huge meta game it used to be, and Blood has a lot more active and engaging playstyle as a result of that. Soul Drinker has made overhealing a lot less wasteful, but learning to time your Death Strikes to react to and heal back the damage that you've taken is a really important nuance to surviving as a Blood DK. There are weak auras and add-ons that you can use to help you see how much damage you've taken within the last 5 seconds, and I still use the same add-on I started using back in Cataclysm when I first began learning to play Blood Death Knight, Blood Shield Tracker. There are quite a few bars in it, but the only thing that I really use from that add-on anymore is just simply the Death Strike Tracker, which normally shows up as red and shows the value of a Death Strike. If the damage you've taken in the last 5 seconds is large enough to make the Death Strike heal value larger than the base of 10% of your health, the bar changes from red to green. That's pretty much all I use it for. I just look to see, did it switch green? Alright, now's probably a solid time to Death Strike. More than anything else, I tend to time my Death Strikes based on my actual health value and where I am in terms of resources. I'd rather have a medium-sized heal when I'm really low on health than a humongous heal when I'm pretty full on health. Let's move on to gear. The gearing priority for Blood DK is pretty simple. Haste is by far the best of all stats. Versatility is next up, and crit is fairly close in value to it. Crit's really good offensively and okay defensively. And Mastery is fairly close in value to that as well. It's not a great defensive stat, but it's not really a great offensive stat either. It's just kind of a lousy stat. Here are the ranks for legendaries. Skullflower's Hemostasis is by far the best legendary for Blood. It's a very big DPS and healing increase through Blood Boil and Death Strike. Basically, once you get this legendary, you'll probably keep it equipped from now all the way up until Battle for Azeroth. There are a few other legendaries that you can kind of swap around based on the situation. Archimonde's Hatred Reborn combos really well with Vampiric Blood, which makes it pretty nice offensively in raids. Because it splits its damage, and it's pretty much only useful in single target, and it really is more of an offensive tool, but it can still be worth a 9 million damage shield on a minute and 15 second cooldown. It's certainly not bad defensively. The legendary chest Soulflayer's Corruption is another solid offensive legendary. It does provide additional healing as well, and it's completely passive, and so it is pretty boring, but it does provide quite a bit of extra healing and damage. As you would expect, it gets better with the number of targets you're attacking at a time, so if you're against 2 targets, it's going to be twice as good as it was against 1, and against 3 targets, it would be 3 times as good, and so on. Shackles of Brenda Ore is another honorable mention. Basically, if you have literally any amount of versatility at all, then every Death Strike will return 6 to 7 runic power. It's not a lot on its own, but it does add up a little bit over time. It's not quite on the tier of the legendaries above it, but it's really not a bad piece, and early on in the expansion, it was the best option available. Another honorable mention goes to Soul of the Death Lord. Basically, it allows you to pick up Rune Tap and Foul Bulwark at the same time. That gives Blood Death Knight another defensive cooldown without losing out on a massive passive health increase, and that's really good for specific boss fights. And last up on the honorable mentions is Sepha's Secret. Sepha's Secret is extremely good in Mythic Plus due to the ability to get reliable procs. Pulling an enemy with Death Grip counts as a crowd control effect, which activates the Sepha's massive haste and move speed buff. Because Blood Death Knight loves haste and moves slowly, Sepha's kind of fills in real nicely there. It's not particularly good in Raid, and there are certainly spots where Soul Flayer's Corruption, even in Mythic Plus, is going to outperform it just because of being able to do lots of AoE damage over a long period of time. But Cepha's is a really solid honorable mention that probably takes the number 2 or number 3 slot in Mythic Dungeons. And lastly, I'm just going to mention Insignia of the Grand Army because it is relatively new. It is also relatively bad. Do not use it unless it's all you have, and in that case, I'm sorry. Best of luck getting something else soon. Now let's touch on trinkets. First up, the Pantheon trinket Aman'Thul's Vision is amazing. Once you get it, you should wear it 100% of the time. The Pantheon trinket Agrimar's Conviction is kind of underwhelming. Unless you have Aman'Thul's Vision, you should always wear it in Antorus. Outside of Antorus, you should probably only wear it if it's a major item level increase, but unfortunately, it probably is at this point. Apocalypse Drive is a fantastic overall damage reduction trinket, and it's particularly strong when tanking AoE packs, such as in Mythic Dungeons. Dima's Glacial Aegis is another strong damage reduction trinket that shines in similar situations to Apocalypse Drive. It is a slightly better DPS trinket than Apocalypse Drive. Smoldering Titan Guard is a really cheesy trinket, and Mastery is not a great stat for Blood. As a result, it's really not good at all under normal circumstances, but in large-scale AoE, the active ability can do absurd amounts of damage, and that's about all it's good for. Unstable Arcano Crystal remains one of the best trinket options available to Blood Death Knights. A 9/10 item level Unstable Arcano Crystal from the Relinquished Vendor on the Vindicar will probably last you through until Battle for Azeroth. It's that good. Darkmoon Deck Immortality is another trinket that's worth way more damage reduction than its item level indicates. It's still probably the most reliable damage reduction trinket, but it has fallen by the wayside as other trinkets are Titan Forging up into the stratosphere. Strength Haste stat sticks are a great trinket option for Blood. While they lack the on-use effects of Apocalypse Drive or Dima's Glacial Aegis, they still offer a lot of offensive and defensive value. You may notice some similarities between the Protection Warrior and Blood DK trinket guide sections, and you know, the two classes gear the same, what can I say? Blizzard did a little copy and paste, why can't I? Let's touch on Tier 21. The three best pieces are, by far, the cloak, gloves, and pants. The fourth piece is a toss-up, and the 4-piece bonus in general really isn't that great. In the best case scenario, the 2-piece reduces Dancing Rune weapons cooldown from 3 minutes to 90 seconds. In that case, the 4-piece provides about a 4.5% increase to rune regeneration. Against a taunt swapping boss, it's probably closer to half that, which isn't great. It does come out when you need it most, right after Dancing Rune weapon has fallen off, but it's just not good. Ideally, a combination of 2-piece and good offset pieces is probably best unless your highest item level pieces are tier. As for Tier 20, both the 2-piece and 4-piece bonuses are better than either of the Tier 21 bonuses in Raid. If you can wear 4-piece Tier 20 or even just 2-piece without sacrificing any item level, go for it. That's probably not realistic though, and neither bonus is game-breakingly strong, so don't be afraid to give up on old tier the moment that you get better pieces. Just to quickly touch on gems and enchants, haste gems forever, Hidden Satyr on your neck for DPS, you can run Heavy Hide for tankiness, but I recommend Hidden Satyr, Strength to Cloak, and Haste to Rings. I created a Blood DK Netherlight Crucible guide video back when it was introduced, so if you'd like a deeper analysis on the NLC, check that out. Overall, Blood DK gets a lot more value out of Tier 2 traits than it does Tier 3 traits. The standout Tier 2 traits are Light Speed and all 5 of the traits that deal direct damage. Relic traits aren't significant to Blood. While there are a couple of standout defensive traits in Carrion Feast and Vampiric Fangs, everything is relatively close in value from a defensive standpoint. While Vein Render is usually the best offensive trait, it's still a pretty slim overall DPS gain. And although Coagulopathy synergizes well with the legendary chest, even then it's not really worth much item level. You pretty much always want to go with the highest item level relic you can get your hands on as a Blood DK. And when item levels are close, base your decision on the tier 2 traits you have available more than the weapon traits available. I think that about covers it. We're pushing for 1,000 subscribers, so if you like this video, please subscribe. We can't wait to find out more about the Battle for Azeroth Alpha and start getting videos up about that real soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.